with the election of chair. Just one second.
Thank you.
Clerk, I will, are you up for nominations at this point?
Yep, I will open it for nominations for the position of chair of the Administration and Operations Committee.
I'll nominate Councillor John Pierce.
I'll second.
Councillor Pierce, will you accept that nomination?
I will, thank you.
Okay, are there any other nominations? Councillor Coleman, do you have your hand up?
I do, and I was going to move nominations to be closed.
Okay, do I have a seconder for closing of nominations? Mayor Bailey? All those in favor of closing nominations? Councillor Pierce is elected chair. One sec here. So I will open up for nominations for vice chair. Councillor House?
Yep, Heather, I'll nominate Councillor LaFerriere for vice chair.
Okay. Do I have any other Oh, Councillor LaFerriere, will you accept the nomination?
I will, thanks to my nominator.
Okay. Are there any other nominations? Councillor Miller?
I was going to nominate Councillor Chambers.
Councillor Chambers? Nope, you decline.
No.
Okay. Any other nominations? Councillor Wheat?
Move the nominations closed.
Okay, do I have a seconder for closing? Councillor McAlpine, all those in favor of closing nominations? Motion is carried. Councillor LaFerriere is the vice chair. I'll turn it over to Councillor Pierce.
Thanks, Heather. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural, I guess it is, Administration and Operations Committee. Just a reminder that we are here on Zoom, so if I could ask everybody to mute unless you're going to be speaking, that would help things out. I appreciate that. Attendance has been taken. Anybody with any additions to the agenda? Okay, it does not appear to. Councillor Miller.
Maybe not necessarily an addition, Mr. Chair, but what I'd like to know is I'm not completely familiar with how these committee structures moved over from previously, because just as we started, we got all buggered up. But when do we see a general manager's update? Like I noticed in this agenda, we don't. Would we see it at another meeting, or should they be incorporated into these meetings?
What I'm going to do is I'm going to, Heather or Michael?
I think in the report that established these committees, the general manager's updates were removed from the agenda. If members wanted an item discussed, they were supposed to let us know, and then we would have the general manager report on that ahead of time.
Okay, so sorry, Mr. Chair, through to Heather then. So it sounds like if we want a general manager's update, we would ask for it ahead of time to be put on the agenda.
Yeah, if there's something you want the general managers to report on, we would just ask that you let them know ahead of time so that they can be prepared with a response.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Wheat?
Yes, this is off topic also, but during this COVID situation, the fact that vaccinations have started in Brant, I wonder if we could put on a routine for every meeting that we have. Councillor Bell, who's the chair of the health unit, update us on how things are going in Brant. I know that's an odd thing to request at this meeting, but things are a little bit odd right now.
That they are. Appreciate that.
Possible, Heather, or maybe I should refer that to Mayor Bailey. At some point in time when we have a meeting, could we get an update, David? You're on the health unit also, on how things are going in Brant. I know by being in a mobile home, what has happened there. I know by having my mother-in-law in Telfer Place, I know what has gone on there.
Okay.
That's all that I know.
Councillor Wheat, if I can jump in there, I think what I'll do is for this evening, Councillor Bell, if you're up to it, I'll put something on their other business, and if you could give us an update, that would be fantastic. Councillor Gatward. You're on mute.
Sorry, I have one question under other business, Mr. Chair.
Did you want to let us know what it is now or at the time?
It's regarding the county drop boxes.
Thank you. Anybody else with additions? Councillor Chambers.
Mr. Chairman, it's not an addition, it's a question about the agenda, anticipating a motion to approve the agenda. If I might ask my question first,
Absolutely.
and that is with regard to the in-camera session with the Drainage Superintendent Services listed. After reading the report, I don't see that it is in any way identifying individual people. It's more of a general report without getting into the specifics. And I'm wondering when that time comes, I'm going to have a rationale to why that's an in-camera report before I would approve to go in camera. So just a heads up, that discussion can occur during the motion to go in camera. But in the meantime, I just wanted to give staff an opportunity to justify the in-camera aspects of that report.
Okay, appreciate that. Anybody else with additions to the agenda? Okay, I don't see any. In that case, can I get a mover and seconder to approve the agenda with the two others? Councillor Chambers, Councillor Howes. Any questions? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Declaration of pecuniary interest. If anybody does have any, please do so at the appropriate time. Moving on to number 5, delegations. We have a delegation this evening. We have Jim Bruzzese with us. Jim, are you back with us?
He's just connecting.
Okay.
Good evening, Jim. Can you hear us now?
I can, thank you.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for joining. Jim is from MBMA Management Consulting and is going to give us a little Brant County water and wastewater rate study. I guess anything you want to say before that, or does anybody want to say anything before that, or should we just get into the presentation? Okay. Jim, I will pass the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. So if we go to the next slide, just by way of introduction, if we go to the next slide. Thanks. So just by way of introduction, Brant County is committed to providing water and wastewater rates that are sustainable, fair, and affordable. And in that regard, in 2019, they prepared a long-range financial plan. And the next step in the process is looking at the rate structure, and that's the intent of this phase of the project. So we're looking at the water and wastewater rate structure to ensure the rates meet the goals and objectives of the county. Next slide, please. So this is basically kind of the process we followed. As I say, we prepared the long-range financial plan. It was completed in 2019. And the intent of that was to make sure that the water and wastewater operations, again, were sustainable and you had enough revenues coming in to sustain the operations properly. So the next phase, which we're in now, is the rate structure review. And in terms of process for the rate structure review, we looked at your existing rate structure. We did some benchmarking across Ontario. In fact, we looked at 100 plus different Ontario municipalities and looking at their rate structure. We said, okay, what do you want to accomplish? What are the goals and objectives in the rate structure? And you'll see those in a few minutes. So then from that, we looked at various rate structure options and tried to determine what best rate structure option can meet those goals and objectives. And then finally, we looked at various options, as I say, and for each of the options, we conducted an impact analysis. How would that affect the customers and the different segmentation of customers? So that brings us, so we've kind of completed that, which I'll present the findings of that this evening. And that brings us to this evening's session. And then after that, the next part of it will be public consultation. So if we go to the next, and actually the next slide after that. So just again, by way of background, this is your existing rates and rate structure. So you can see in the water operations, you have a volumetric rate. It's a uniform rate, so everybody pays the same, $1.43 per cubic meter. And then in the wastewater, $1.54. And in terms of the fixed, as we say, there's a two-part rate structure. So the fixed component, you're getting the revenues from that from the various meters. And the fixed component is based on meter size. And it's in accordance with leading practices on how you're collecting the fixed component. So we would recommend that you continue to collect the fixed charge based on meter size. And that's, as I say, leading practice in accordance with Canadian Waterworks Association. Go to the next slide. So as I say, we looked at, we did some benchmarking, and we looked at various municipalities. And just to give you a couple of examples here, we looked at for 2020, we looked at the residential cost of service, assuming that a customer would use 200 cubic meters of annual consumption. And you can see from this chart, what we did is we broke it down. We had 45 different Southwest municipalities in the survey. And across Ontario, we had over 100 different municipalities. So based on that 200 cubic meters a year, you can see from this chart, residential customers in Brant County are higher than the Ontario municipal average and the Southwest average. And this is driven basically two main factors. One is a relatively high average fixed cost allocation, which I'll go into in a bit further. And then secondly, you have a fairly complex system. It's diverse, and it is more expensive to operate than a lot of other systems. So you have a large infrastructure with relatively few customers, so that has an impact on rates. So if you go to the next slide. So also we looked at, okay, so let's assume that if there's a commercial customer and they use 10,000 cubic meters a year, and you can see in Brant County, you're actually lower than the Southwest average. And in that category, you're also lower than the Ontario average. But basically 10,000 cubic meters in terms of the water usage of commercial customers in Brant County, that doesn't affect a whole lot of your customers. It only impacts 86 customers. That's all you have that use 10,000 cubic meters plus a year. Most of your commercial customers are below 500 cubic meters a year. So go to the next slide. So what we did here is we looked at the residential consumption, and we wanted to see the pattern, what's happening in terms of the residential consumption. And you can see that your residential consumption for the first part of the year up until June is relatively flat. Then you see in the summer months, the consumption increases greatly. So it goes from a low of about 85,000 cubic meters in February to about 140,000 cubic meters in July and August. So that's about a 65% increase in consumption in the summer months. So that's a real challenge, especially if conservation is one of your prime objectives, which we consider it would be. So one of the things when we look at the rate structure, we want to make sure that try to smooth that a little bit and try to put an incentive in place to reduce that summer consumption. So if we go to the next slide. So again, that's by way of background. So the next thing we looked at, okay, what are the things we're trying to accomplish in terms of a rate structure? And these are the sort of the guiding principles that we used when we looked at the various options, and we compared them against these principles to see how they would impact each of these principles. So the first one being revenue stability, you want to make sure you have a steady stream of revenues. Fairness and equity, that all customers are contributing fair and equitable to the system. Water conservation, we want to encourage water conservation. We want to ensure residential affordability. We want to maintain economic development as much as possible. And we want it relatively easy to understand in terms of the customers understanding the rate structure. So if we go to the next slide. So we looked at, as I say, various rate structure options. So if we go to the next slide. So across Ontario, what we found is that 90% of the Ontario municipalities, the 100 plus municipalities we looked at, have a two-part rate structure similar, consistent with Brant County. They have a fixed monthly, and in terms of the fixed monthly, some municipalities, very few, are charging every customer the same flat rate for the fixed monthly. But most municipalities, the great majority of municipalities, they do on the same basis you're doing, they charge the fixed based on the meter size. In terms of the volumetric, there's actually 5 different types of volumetric charges that we found across Ontario municipalities. One being a uniform, which is the Brant approach. Everybody pays the same for the consumption. A couple of municipalities have an inclining rate, whereby as consumption increases, it inclines. Some had a declining rate, and some had a humpback, which I'll explain in a minute. And then there was some municipalities that have a seasonal rate to look at that high summer consumption period. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of the fixed versus volumetric, again, what we did is we benchmarked it across Ontario. And what we found is that there's no standard for how much you should be collecting from the fixed component relative to the volumetric component. It ranged from a low of 0%, actually, some municipalities have no fixed, to a high of 100%, which typically those municipalities had no meter. In the case of Brant, you're collecting in water 67% of the total revenue needs from the fixed component and 33% from the volumetric component. And in wastewater, you're collecting 45% from fixed and 55% from volumetric. So in water, you're higher than the survey average of 100 different municipalities. The survey average is 43% for fixed, and as I say, you're at 67%. And in wastewater, you're relatively close to the average. You're at 45% from fixed, and the average was 41% from fixed. So while you have a high fixed component, it does support the goal that we talked about earlier in terms of revenue stability, but it does pose challenge in terms of conservation. There's no incentive to conserve water, and having such a high fixed component, it causes a little bit of concern too for the residential affordability in terms of there's a large number of customers that you have that are very low volume. And so they're paying a high fixed proportion, so they have it may cause some concern in terms of revenue, residential affordability. So if you go to the next slide. So as I say, we looked at the various volume options for collecting the volumetric rate. The uniform, which is the current Brant County approach, it's actually the most common across the municipalities that we surveyed. So everybody pays the same. As I say, some municipalities have an inclining rate. So as consumption increases, the rates increase. So that certainly has meets the objective of conservation. There's an incentive there to conserve, but it hits the small commercial users extremely hard in that approach. And so we actually dismiss that. Some municipalities have a declining rate structure, which the high volume users pay less than the low volume users, which essentially are residential users. So it does hurt the the residential sector even further than it is now. So we discounted that as well. And then the other rate structure option that we looked at is what we call the humpback. And in terms of the humpback, there's a rate for initial consumption. Then as consumption increases, there's an increased rate. And as the consumption increases further, there's a further rate increase. And then once you get into the very high volume customers, it drops back down to basically the residential rate. So that we feel is a rate structure worth pursuing. It does meet your goals of conservation, residential affordability, and economic development. Go to the next slide. So in terms of the fixed monthly charge, we did consider options to reduce the allocation to help improve this residential affordability that we talked about earlier. So we have some recommendations in that regard. And in terms of the volumetric rate structure, as I say, we looked at the goals and objectives, different types of rate structures, and we boiled it down that the options that should be pursued is looking at the uniform rate and the humpback rate. So if we go to the option analysis, next slide. Yeah, next one after that. Thank you. So the options that we consider, again, worth pursuing is looking at the status quo, which is your uniform volumetric charge and having a fixed monthly charge, and continuing to collect the same amount of revenues from the fixed component that you're currently collecting, and the wastewater revenues from the fixed component that you're currently collecting. So no change to the fixed that you're collecting, the amount of money you're collecting from fixed. So it's status quo. Option 2 is looking at, okay, let's look at a uniform volumetric charge and a fixed monthly charge, just like you have your current rate structure. However, on the fixed monthly charge, in this option, we looked at reducing the total amount that you're collecting from fixed. So right now in 2021, you're collecting 66%, or in 2020, actually, you're collecting 66%. And in option 2, we're looking at, okay, let's drop it to 64% and then have a phase in period where you drop it, and in 2024, it would reduce to 58%. By reducing the fixed, it causes shifts in who pays, and that's why it's a fairly conservative reduction in fixed, but it reduces a lot of the volatility that would occur if you increase that fixed or decrease that fixed further. Option 3 is looking at the fixed monthly charges, also collecting less from the fixed, 64%, and using, instead of the volumetric rate, the change in this one is looking at a humpback rate. Okay, so the next slide, please. So we're looking at the, okay, how does this going to, each of these scenarios, options, impact the customers? So the status quo, again, essentially, it's just the increase in the 2021 operating budget, and how would that impact your 7,800 customers? And each customer would experience an increase of about 0 to 3%. If you go to the next slide. Option 2, which is the uniform rate, but you're reducing that fixed component, a 2% reduction in fixed each year over the next 4 years in water and 1% in wastewater. So you can see from this that the total number of customers, the majority of customers still experience a 0 to 3% increase. But what happens here, because we're reducing that fixed, 860 primarily residential customers would experience a decrease between 0 and minus 5%. And then because you're reducing the fixed, you're increasing the volumetric to collect the same amount of revenues. So what we're seeing is a 3 to 5% increase in the number of customers, 1,259, and then a 5 to 8% increase in 164 customers. So the majority of customers would receive an increase of 0 to 3%. Next slide, please. So what we did is we looked at that, so we wanted to break it down a little bit further. Well, how does it impact the residential customer and the commercial customers? And you can see from this, these two graphs here, in the residential side, you have about 7,200 residential customers, of which 679 would have a decrease in rates. 5,333 would have a 0 to 3%. And then you can see that number of customers that have increases above 3%. And in the commercial, because you have a significant number of low volume commercial users, 181 of those customers would experience a benefit. And again, these are very low volume commercial customers, and they would get a decrease in rates. 200 of your customers would have an increase in rates, and then the fairly high volume customers would have further increases. So if we go to the next slide. So this brings us to the option 3, which is, again, that humpback rate structure. And what we did on this one is we looked at a tiered rate structure. So 0 to 15 cubic meters would have a certain rate. And then when you look at customers that have a consumption between 15 and 45 cubic meters a month, the rate would increase by 10%. And then if you have customers above that between 45 and 100 cubic meters, there's a 15% increase. And then tier 4 brings it back down to the same level as tier 1. So what happens here is you can see that tier 1, a low rate helps the affordability, the residential customers. But there's an incentive there to conserve, because as the water increases, the volumetric rate increases. So again, it provides that incentive to conserve. So if we look at the next slide, so 74% of the customers of residential consumption is in would be in tier 1, and 67% of customers' consumption is in tier 4. So if we look at the next slide, this gets into the impacts. So you can see on this slide, in this case, 1,655 residential customers would experience a decrease in rates. 4,400, an increase of 0 to 3%. And then the customers, 3 to 5%, 5 to 8%, these are high volume residential customers, which again are causing that peak period that we saw in the consumption, in the summer consumption period. And then in the case of commercial, as I say, you have a large number of low volume commercial customers. 228 of those would receive a decrease. 133 customers would have an increase up to 3%. And you can see some of the high volume commercial customers would have higher increases. Next slide, please. So just to boil it down, customer impact by option. This is just to kind of illustrate, okay, let's look at different customers, segmentation of customers, various consumptions. And you can see from this, and then let's compare the 3 options. You can see from this chart, a customer consuming 100 cubic meters a year. In option 1, they would have that 3% increase. In option 2, those customers would have about a 1% increase. And then in option 3, it's close to 0, it'd be very negligible, the increase. And then when you get into a little bit higher, 200 cubic meters, which is approximately the average of a residential customer, option 3 on 200 cubic meters is the best option for that group of ratepayers. And then when you get into the higher volume customers, and there is customers in Brant County that we saw in the residential sector that consume 500 cubic meters plus, actually. You can see when you start getting into that, the increase is around, in option 3, is around 4%. So as I say, that's providing that incentive to conserve. And then when you get into the higher volume, 600 cubic meters, it's about an 8% increase. And then 1,500 cubic meters, it's about a 9% increase. And then when you get into the very large customers, 10,000 cubic meters, it on option 3, it comes down because that rate drops. Next slide. So just to kind of evaluate it against the different guidelines, criteria. In terms of revenue stability, the status quo is the most stable because you're collecting most of your money from fixed. You don't have to worry about consumption and rainfall and things like that. In terms, but however, the other two options provide good revenue stability. We don't think there's a problem there. In terms of fairness and equity, we think option 3 is the fairest and most equitable approach. In terms of conservation, we saw from that previous chart, the option 3 provides the best conservation measures. The one area where option 3 is a little bit, it's a little bit harder to understand from a customer perspective in the sense that you have different tiers and different rates. So from that regard, of the 3 options, it's from a customer perspective, it's a little bit harder to understand. In terms of residential affordability, the option 3 provided the best option in that regard. And then economic development, again, option 1 is the best in that. However, we don't think that's a primary consideration because most of the commercial users are very low volume users. So go to the next slide. So what we recommend is gradually reduce that fixed monthly allocation over a 4-year period. That resulted in a 2% reduction in water annually over the next 4 years on the fixed side, and then a 1% reduction in wastewater fixed over the next 4 years. Implement the humpback rate structure, which is at option 3. We're also recommending, in addition to the humpback rate structure, we're recommending a residential seasonal water rate for consumption over 45 cubic meters. And that's only on the water side. The charge would only apply to the water, not the wastewater. So that premium would apply in the months May to September, where we saw those huge spikes in consumption. And that further supports conservation. And then the changeover in rates, we're recommending that it be changed May 1st. Next slide. So in terms of other considerations, one of the other things, if you decide to pursue this and reduce the fixed charge and have an increase in the volumetric charge, one of the concerns is that you may have further or an influx of high water bills that could become an issue. High water bills due to faulty plumbing, etc. So what a lot of municipalities have done, they established a formal leak adjustment policy, which clearly defines a period when eligibility would kick in and you get an adjustment if there's a leak not caused by your own activities. So these policies, they encourage conservation because you get timely repairs of leaks. It's a consistent approach in responding to higher water bills. It's a transparent process, so everybody understands, okay, I'm eligible because I meet this criteria. And it establishes a threshold for high water bill consumptions, and it reduces the administrative work and operational work associated with investigating high water complaints. And it provides a more transparent, fair approach. So again, if you're going to reduce the fixed and increase the volumetric on the option 2 or option 3, we recommend that you also look at a leak forgiveness policy as well. Next slide. So next step in the process is looking at public consultation. And I think there's on February 11th, there's a virtual open house session that's been planned. Next slide. So that's the end of the presentation. I do have further slides in your package that shows the rates for the various options. Just briefly. So
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Jim. That's a great presentation with a lot of information there. We will go to council. Anybody have questions? Councillor House.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Jim for delivering a lot of information. That's a lot to digest. I think anyone would find the 25% figure to be a little shocking in comparison to the majority of the other municipalities in Ontario, although not completely shocking, because this is a topic that I know most of us hear about once in a while. I do look forward to the public engagement step of this process, because I think there'll be, I hope there's some very interesting dialogue there. My specific question for Jim is, early on in your presentation, you said that we have a large infrastructure with a relatively small number of customers. So my question is, as our municipality grows, and we know it is growing, is there an opportunity for us to gain some economy of scale? Like, is like there's a perception within the residents of our community that you know, all this growth is costing a lot of money, and it's putting pressure on our capacity for water and wastewater. But is there actually a potential upside where eventually we have twice as many customers? Is there not? Does it work in such a way that some of those costs become a little more affordable with the broader customer base? Thank you.
yeah, I can start to answer, and perhaps somebody from engineering could also help answering that question. But yes, I think that a lot of your linear infrastructure is in place, and then I think you have some excess capacity in your plant operations. So as a result of that, this new customer base would be an advantage in the sense that there would be more customers to support the infrastructure. So and then the other thing is that a lot of new infrastructure, if you require new infrastructure, would be recovered from development charges.
Okay, thanks very much.
Mr. Walton, did you want to add anything to that?
Through the committee chair to Councillor Howes, I agree with what Jim has to say. What we'll see here is we'll see a lag period, though. We've got a tremendous investment that we have to make through in improvements to the system over this period of time, over the next 10 plus years, when you take into account what's happening in Paris and what then will follow in St. George. So yes, we will have a more compact and efficient system, because the new development is all on smaller lots, more dense and the like. So we will see a more efficient system, but it's 10 to 15 years out when we'll see the how that impacts the efficiency of the rates.
Thanks, Rob.
Okay, thank you for that. I got Councillor Bell and then Councillor Gatward.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Jim. Great presentation, lots of good information. I have 2 or 3 questions. The first one relates to the benchmarking that you have. It would appear that our residential customers are disadvantaged relative to neighbouring municipalities, and our commercial customers are advantaged. So are we in a place where our residential customers are subsidising our commercial customers? And it would be helpful to illustrate that if you could tell me what is the balance of our total revenues that comes from residential and from commercial?
In terms of the cross subsidization, Um, the issue on that is that fixed component that we're recommending we reduce. The illustration that we showed was a customer using 10,000 cubic meters. In the county, that only represents 86 customers. So there's not a whole lot of customers that kind of benefit from your current rate structures when you get into 10,000 cubic meters. The majority of your commercial customers in the presentation are relatively small users of water and wastewater operations. And so that these small users, their rates are high as well. And these are in the commercial sector. So again, adjusting the rate structure and the reducing the fixed helps those commercial customers, those small commercial customers as well. In terms of how much you're collecting, I think you're collecting 80% of your revenues from the residential sector and 20% from the non-residential sector.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Second big question is what value should we place on conservation?
I think it's significantly important because the longer that you can use your existing infrastructure and maintain without having to expand it because of growth, that certainly does help reduce your capital expenditures on a go-forward basis. And obviously it's good for the environment.
Thank you. So do you feel that we have gone far enough in the option 3 that you've brought forward?
One of the things we did look at is reducing, what would help would be reducing the fixed further. And we did look at that option by a more significant reduction in the fixed. But what happens, it created massive shifts across the different consumption ratepayers, and it would be very, very difficult from their perspective because it would have huge impact, potentially huge impacts on their budgets, etc. So it would take it would cause a disruption, if you like. So that's why we're recommending reducing the fixed, but on a gradual phased approach. And that's how we come up with the numbers that we did come up with in reducing the fixed. We wanted to minimize as much as possible that huge shift that would occur.
I think to me, it's worthy of a debate as to what value we put on conservation. I think you have made a choice there. I think it's something that we in council ought to have some discussion about. I think it's really important that we recognize the signals we give when we talk about and act upon conservation. I'm going to leave that one there, but I have one final question, and that's last week we agreed to increase our property taxes by about $5 per month on average for the average house. What would we have to do to take $5 per month out of the system to balance that out? Recognizing that conservation is probably the place where you could get most of it, or alternatively in your humpback system, I'm surprised that you go back down to the same base rate for 0 cubic meters per month when you get to 100. It seems to disadvantage or not put any emphasis on the difficulties that very low users of water face.
In terms of the setting the parameters and then going back down, a lot of your commercial customers, depending on the consumption, would be impacted by the gradual rate increase of 10% in the first over 15 cubic meters, and then 15% over 45 cubic meters. So that has an impact on a lot of those commercial customers. And then, so as a result of that, we felt that, and a lot of your customers were kind of in that range. So if we went back, or if we didn't go back down to the residential rate in the last consumption grouping, it would have and we did a customer by customer analysis on that. It had a significant increase in the number of your commercial customers. So that's why we didn't go further on that.
Yeah, I think this still comes straight back to this balance between residential and commercial customers. I'm thinking of the folks who may use 2 or 3 cubic meters a month. You know, a single woman living on her own, a single person living on her own, on their own. Their bill is per cubic meter in total, far in excess of what our commercial customers are paying. So I would really like to see more work done on shifting that balance so the low volume users, people that can't afford the high fixed price that we're putting on our services, can in fact afford it in the longer run. And that's the end of my questions.
Thank you for that. Councillor Gatward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, through you to Jim and Rob. The page 31 of the presentation, there's a list of various items: online survey, postcard mail out, frequently asked Q&As, and the virtual open house that's being held February 11th. Are we doing all the items on that list? And could, to help with a postcard mail out, could something go in the initial tax billing for this year regarding this? If you're on municipal water, there could be a blurb in the information sheet that goes with the taxes and give them information so they could go online and do the survey. Or if they get it before February 11th, which I don't know that they would, but it's possible, they could participate in the virtual open house sessions. Is that a possibility?
Mr. Walton.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Gatward. We're looking at all the ways to make this efficient. We're actually looking at with our service provider Energy Plus of there's actually notes that they can make on the bills too. So we're looking at all the options as to how we can do this the most efficiently and try and get the most people possible to participate. Obviously we're dealing in a very tight time frame here, so we have to. But we're looking at possibly doing all of those things to try and get as many people to participate as possible.
I see the treasurer.
Yeah, Heather, you want to pipe in on that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the tax inserts have already gone to the printer, so we didn't make that one.
Too late. Oh well. Thank you. And yeah, I found the presentation quite interesting. I didn't realize there were so many different ways of billing for water and wastewater, but I guess it's similar to how Hydro One bills for their time of use services to their electricity customers, such as me. If we use electricity in off hours, we get it cheaper. And this is a similar idea. And as far as conservation goes, and I can understand Councillor Bell's concern, Hydro's been preaching that for a number of years, and I think that we do need to encourage conservation because...
Councillor Gatward, do we have another question?
Yes, we do. We need to increase the awareness about conservation. Are we going to have another drought this summer like we've had in the last few summers? I don't know if our water manager follows that type of forecasting, but I know we had to put water restrictions on in Mount Pleasant because the pumps were running full time, and I don't want to see that scenario happen again. So if, through you to Mr. Walton, if we use option 3, that would discourage the water, those high residential water users, and also increase water conservation, would it not?
Sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Gatwood. Yes, and please note that we have brought up the suggestion for us to consider the actual seasonal rate increase too, to deal with issues of irrigation. And it was very evident in the one of the early slides there of the amount of water usage in the summer months. Certainly is aided and abetted by irrigation. So yes, these measures would both be positive towards that. The seasonal and the humpback are both positive towards conservation. One thing we got to think about in conservation, and Councillor Bell alluded to this before, about using conservation to drive down the bills. This is a co-op here. Everybody has to pay into the pot, and we need to collect that fixed amount of money, which we need to run the systems. So the more we drive conservation, the more we're going to change the rates. And municipalities and water providers all across North America have seen this phenomena by the change in things like low flush toilets and front load washing machines with less use, less irrigation. We've all seen decreased per capita uses of water, and we have many jurisdictions where we've had to over time look at how these rates go and then actually increase the volumetrics over time because people are conserving. So this is a long game, and we have to just think about that as we're going ahead. We'll start seeing the impacts of our changes. And if we are successful in knocking down a lot of the summer irrigation usage, it will have an impact on the total income we collect too. And then we'll have to adjust for that over time too.
Okay, my second question, Mr. Chair, you mentioned the seasonal rates. Would that be an additional number of cents or dollars added to each cubic meter, or how would that work?
Rob?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Gatwood. What's being proposed is during the months of potential irrigation, May, June, July, August, maybe early September, that there'd be an additional surcharge put on for all residential usage in above 45 cubic meters per month. So anybody that's using, basically just water they need for their residents isn't going to pay the surcharge. It'll be those that get into the realm where they're irrigating.
But you don't know what the surcharge would be.
30% is what's being proposed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Ferrier.
Thank you, Councillor Pierce, Mr. Chair. This is a quick one. I'm not sure who to address it to on staff, but we just launched yesterday Engage Brant, which is a website to help engage on issues just like this. I'm wondering if somebody from staff could, for myself, for members of council, and for members of the public, maybe use this as an example of how we would use Engage Brant to get engagement on this particular issue. This might be a good case study because it's pertinent in folks' minds right now.
Great idea. Anybody want to speak to that? Mr. Walton?
Through Mr. Chair to Councillor Ferrier. Yes, actually we had a staff meeting this afternoon. We talked about how we're going to use Engage Brant for this project. So, so it is going to be used for this project. We will be posting material on ahead of the public meeting for people to review, similar to anybody that participated in Cedar Street. We did that ahead of Cedar Street and then did a presentation at the meeting. It'll be different to have them much different for this one, but a lot of that material will be posted. There will be an online survey and questionnaire for people to fill out, and there also will be all the background information will also be there. That's what's being talked about as we speak now.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Anybody else with questions? Okay, I don't see anybody's hands up. So Jim, thank you very much again for that presentation. Can we get a motion to, I guess, to receive? Councillor Howes? Councillor Wheat? Any further questions? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Moving on to consent items, we have one consent item to be approved. I'm not sure if there needs to be any discussion on that. Councillor Miller? Move to approve. Seconder, Mayor Bailey. Any questions? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Consent items to be received. Looks as though there's 7 of them. Do we want to move them all at once? Does anybody want any pulled? I'll start with that. Anybody want any pulled? Councillor Miller.
Question on 6.2.1.
Okay. Anybody else want one of them pulled? Councillor Gatward. You're muted, Joan.
I just wanted to mention 6.2.5. It doesn't need pulling, but I wanted to thank Councillor Anatoski for all her work on the early or equal ground community gardens. And that was a great report she sent us.
Thank you for pointing that out. Councillor Miller, your question on 6.2.1?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Very quick question. In it, he talked about the different testing results that got to be released by March 31st of the year. I'm just wondering, how does the average person or even the average counselor go about finding this annual report?
Who can answer that? Mr. Walton.
To you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Miller. These reports will all be coming to council and they have to be approved by council. So they'll be coming in February.
Okay, I'll look forward to it.
Okay. Councillor Ferrier.
Yes, through you. This is a procedural question. I was working with Councillor Antoski from Brantford on the previous community garden, Victory Garden piece, and we were looking at some potentials for community gardens in the future. Would this be the appropriate committee if Councillor Antoski wants to come present as the equal grounds person to our council, or should it be council more broadly?
I would suggest it would be this one. Is anybody opposed to that?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we'll take it from that. Okay, I don't see any other questions, so we have a mover and a seconder. Councillor Howes. Mayor Bailey. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Move on to staff reports. Biggers Lane. There is a recommendation in front of us. I'm not sure if somebody wants to speak to it first. It's pretty self-explanatory. Are there any questions on the recommendation? Councillor Miller.
No questions, just want to express my extreme frustration at a process that I was around for when we started 10 years ago, and here we are today. So, I guess I wanted to know, through you, Mr. Chair, I know we talked about reducing the amount of garbage either through recycling or whatever. No real effect or benefits from that. I'm just wondering, have we seen any time savings on those efforts that we've made in the recent past?
Who can speak to that? Mr. Walton, you're on the hot seat tonight.
Thank you, Chairman Pierce. Yes, we've brought reports forward and decision packages over the last couple of years to do some reduction in the amount of landfill material. The one program that we did in 2020 with the construction demolition waste diversion was quite successful. And I think we were predicting a 4% diversion by that. And we will be reporting on that to council. I think that we were probably close to that. I don't have it off the top of my head. To make some other strides, our diversion rate isn't top tier if you compare it to our comparators in the area. We would have to make some substantial changes to our program. The top municipalities around us that have much higher diversions mostly have bag tags. So that would be a shift in how we do the business and how we charge for it. Clearly analysis on the different options, but in the time period we're talking here towards when Biggers as it exists right now will be full, there's not enough time for us to implement change to change that.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Councillor Gatward.
Thank you, Mr.
You're okay, Joan. We hear you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Rob, the environmental assessment report will be released to the public and agency review on February 15th. When will council receive a copy of that? Before that, or the same day, or?
Through the chair to Councillor Gatward, it will be available at that time. We certainly could, I guess, arrange to get it to anybody that wants it. This is a very thick document. Like, I don't think that we should be printing these for people that, unless they request them, and you know, we're talking volumes here of
So
colored maps, and very expensive to put together.
Yeah.
Not even easy to send electronically. So I guess the question is if anybody wants them. The gist of what's in these was run by council and Public Works Committee and council in 2018. Not really much has changed from that period of time. It's going to be available, and if people really want it, we can make it available.
Well, what was made available in 2018? I don't remember. Was there an executive summary or a shorter report that summarized the documents you're describing?
I believe that there was a consultant presentation to committee, if I remember rightly.
Okay.
Off my head.
And the other question I had, you're going to explore different options for waste disposal. And the report mentioned private landfills. Where's the nearest private landfill from Brant County? I didn't know we had those.
Mr. Walton?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Gatward, and I believe Matt DeHaant's on the line here, so he may be able to help me out with this question if we let him in here. But certainly, Walker Environmental has a private landfill in Niagara region in Thorold. Is one that I know of. There is a landfill down in the area of Chatham that's a private landfill. There are a few of them around. And
Matt,
this what we're talking about here is for the interim period until we had ours constructed.
Matt, did you want to add anything to that, or?
Through you, Chair. No, those are the two closest that we have. There are a couple other ones down Niagara Way too. And I mean, there are other private outlets, not necessarily just landfills too, EFWs and such within Ontario.
Thank you for that.
Does anybody have an idea of what the cost per transport load would be to the county? Or no? It's okay if you don't.
Rob or Matt, anything on that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Gatward. We've looked at this and we think that our cost in the interim would be similar to what our costs are right now when you consider everything. So it isn't necessarily a huge increase in cost. Am I right on that, Matt?
Through you, Chair, that's correct. Our neighbor to the south, Norfolk County, currently transports all their materials out of site. They take theirs to Niagara to Walker's landfill, and their costs would be similar to what it costs us to operate our landfill per ton basis.
Okay.
So would this start when our Mterra contract ends in 2024 and we're out of landfill space and approximately?
Through you, Chair, to Councillor Gatworth, estimating right now with the surveys that have been completed, we're looking at running out of capacity in late 2023, early 2024. So it may line up close to our end date with Mterra, but that is part of the discussion that staff would have to have with Mterra on if we do have to have a bulking location or a different location for them to dump at, how that could impact that contract for a short period of time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and my apologies to committee. I did not get a mover and a seconder for the recommendation before we started that discussion. So Councillor Coleman, Councillor Wheat, thank you very much. Any other discussion, questions? Okay, we've got a mover and a seconder for the recommendation. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. 7.2, COVID penalty and interest relief. Get a mover for that. Councillor Wheat, Councillor Howes. Any questions on that? Councillor Gatward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, we're going to be forgiving interest and on our accounts receivable as well as taxes. And will that interest be recovered by Treasury from the COVID-19 funding that we received from the province?
Who can speak to that? Robin, you're coming online to speak to that? You're on mute if you, oh, there we go.
Sorry, I knew I was on mute. So through you, Mr. Mayor, if we need to make up that money, we would take it from the Safe Restart funding for COVID-19.
Okay.
So if we don't take it from the COVID-19 funding, then that revenue will be just absorbed by the rest of the budget?
Right, so at the end of the year, when we look at our total revenues and our total expenses, if we're short, like we might be able to make up for that money in another area, but if we're short, we can take that money from the COVID funding that's in the reserve.
Yeah. It's my thinking we should take it from the COVID funding because that's why we're doing it, and it shouldn't impact other areas of the budget.
I think, sorry to interrupt you there, Councillor Gatward. I think Robin did say that was an option, so it's not like it's off the table.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Councillor Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question to the author of the report. Said tax arrears went from 2.6 to 4.6%. I think on paper that sounds like a small amount, a 2% increase, but to go from 2.6 to 4.6 is a 77% increase. When we look at, it didn't say this in the report, and I wasn't clear, the 2.6 to 4.6, is that, are you measuring the number of properties in arrears, or is that the total tax dollars in arrears? I wasn't clear on that from the report.
Who can comment on that?
It's Christine Staley.
Hey, Christine.
It is actually based on the tax dollars that we gather and not the number of people that are in arrears. The number of people sorry.
Yeah. No, well, I was just going to ask Christine, then through you, Mr. Chair. Is that a fair assessment that that's gone up by 77% in 1 year from 2019 to 2020?
It is a fair assessment. The arrears did increase. It's because we stopped the actual tax sale process and we did not register any of the properties that were in tax sale.
Okay. All right, Christine, gives me something else to worry about. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. We've got a mover and a seconder. All in favor of the recommendation? Opposed? It's carried. Moving on to 8.1 communications. City of Brantford resolution. Can I get a mover to put it on the table? Councillor Coleman. Seconder for that, Councillor Ferrier. Any discussions? Councillor Miller.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. I read it. I'm not quite sure what it means. I think it means that the city will do the maintenance of the boundary roads unless there's something untoward that happens. Am I reading that correct? Because I don't want to see that this end up at a liaison committee either. So
Well,
I just want to make sure that I'm interpreting that correctly.
I appreciate that question because I kind of had the same one. Mr. Walton, can you clarify that, please?
To Mr. Chair, to Councillor Miller, yes, we've slightly amended the boundary agreement and made it very clear who's maintaining what roads. And we're all agreeing on that with you know, the changes in the boundary agreement, all that sort of stuff is all it's all worked out now, and we've got it all pinned down as to who's doing what. And the reason you didn't see a report come on this is that staff is actually delegated to sign an agreement of this nature at Brant.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, fair enough. I appreciate the answer. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Rob.
Okay. Any other questions on the report? Councillor Gatward. You're on mute, Joan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Rob. So staff was allocated or delegated to sign the new amended agreement for the road maintenance for our boundary roads. So the city is now responsible for all those roads, both sides. Can you, there's only a handful of them. Can you name them off the top of your head, Rob? Just so that if we get a phone call and say, how come Phelps Road isn't plowed? I can say, well, that's because it's the city's responsibility.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Gatward, no, I cannot remember these all off the top of my head. Yeah, it's sort of a dangerous thing to do now when I don't remember them. And
Yeah.
actually, this agreement has services going both ways. Like, we actually do some work for them, and they do some work for us too. So it isn't a one-way street. It does define who does what. Like the Cockshut Bridge, for example, we actually take the lead on the OSIM reports for that, for any upgrades of that. It's stated clearly in the agreement as to what, so everybody knows what they need to do, and we both have responsibilities.
Well, could we have a copy of that then, please, so that as councillors, we know whose responsibility it is? I have had questions in the past about how come so-and-so's plowing Mount Pleasant Road. So I need to know what's in our new agreement or amended agreement so that I can answer questions I might get. Thank you.
Okay.
Through the chair, we'd be pleased to provide that to anybody that wants it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so I guess just move to receive the communication. We've got a mover and a seconder. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Other business. We had a couple with other business. We're going to, Councillor Bell, you were just going to give us an update as to Brant County Health Unit, how things are progressing with that. So if you could give us a quick update, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, I will. First of all, I'd say there's a lot of information already available. So if for those of you that are not aware, there are two sites that I could point you to. One is ontario.ca, and they have information about the whole of Ontario, but they cover specifically Brant County Health Unit. One word of caution is that the ontario.ca numbers include 6 nations. When you go to bchu.org, which is the health unit website page, it only covers the city and the county. So where are we? As of this morning, there are 76 active cases in the city and the county, and that's significantly reduced over the last 10 days or so. I think we're getting close to nearly 200 active cases at one point. So whether this is a measure of lockdown and other restrictions having an effect, I couldn't say hand on heart, but it's nevertheless the right direction to travel. We had 6 new cases yesterday. I think towards the middle of last week, we were getting upwards of 28, 30 cases per day. So again, that's a significant drop. We have 4 people in hospital right now. Some key measures, the reproductive number, which as long as it's less than 1, that tells you you're sort of getting a handle on controlling the virus. and it's gone down from 1.4 2 weeks ago to 0.77. So we're again heading in the right direction. The weekly incidence rate, which is a measure of how many cases per 100,000 of people, bearing in mind we've got about 145 in the Brant County Health Unit area. It's down now to 87, and about a week ago it was around about 120. So again, reflecting a downward trend. And the positivity rate on the testing that we're doing is dropping. So it's down towards about 1 now, and it was up beyond 2, I think beyond 3 last week. There are some outbreaks that have come forward in the last week. Stedman Hospice has 1 patient and 5 members of staff that have been diagnosed as having COVID. And the Fox Ridge Centre likewise has an outbreak. I can't remember the exact numbers there. On the positive side, we've vaccinated 1,607 people, which is slightly over 1% of our population. Probably more like 2% when you think about the people that shouldn't be vaccinated at the moment. But that's encouraging, and the vaccines are now capable of being taken out to the long-term care centres and residential homes. So not everything has to happen in a hospital now. And we're engaging the paramedics in that activity. And that if you remember back to the flu immunization program late last year, that was very successful. They do an excellent job. And I think the health unit has got its hands around how to manage this. What they haven't got full control over is when vaccines arrive. And that is more of a provincial issue. And I think if you see in the newspaper, the supply of the Pfizer vaccine is going to come to a bit of a halt next week, while the Pfizer factory in Belgium is being upgraded to allow for increased production. We will catch up, but how it affects us locally, I'm not 100% sure. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that update. Are there any questions? I think we'll just leave it as the update as is, and I appreciate that. And absolutely, the numbers are definitely trending in a much better direction than they have been of late. So that's fantastic, and thank you to everybody for doing their part. Councillor Gatwood, you had something else for other business regarding drop boxes?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last time we were on lockdown and people had to pay taxes, the drop boxes were open and available for people to put their tax envelopes in. And I'm expecting that they're going to be open again for the February installment. I guess the reason I brought this up, Mr. Chairman, I got my dog license renewal in the mail today, and it only allows for the Paris and Burford office drop boxes. So I just wanted to make sure tonight that the other 3 would be open as well for the outlying areas of the county and for customer service. Thank you.
Can we get confirmation of that? Robin?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the drop boxes are always open. They've never been closed. So
Good to know.
okay.
So they will be monitored, or that if somebody puts their dog tag thing in there, it'll be picked up at some point.
That's correct. It's picked up every week.
Thank you very much. That's great news, Robin. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so that's those that put their arm up for other business. We will move on. The next is for in camera, and prior to going in camera, Councillor Chambers, you requested some information earlier.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm just wondering if staff can comment on the rationale for going in camera. We're talking about positions rather than people, in my understanding of the report, recognizing that the current position is vacant. So I'm just wondering why this is an in-camera session as opposed to an open session where we can talk about the position and recommendations in the public venue.
Mr. Bradley, you can comment on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And it's council's decision on at any time that you want to take a report in camera. We make the recommendations. So our recommendation would, first of all, acknowledge most of this report would be appropriately dealt with in open session. There is a specific position noted, as well as a promotion for the specific position, as well as a reference to an active recruitment. And so that's why our recommendation, those are the only reasons why we recommended it be addressed in camera. If council would like to deal with the report in open session, our suggestion would be we delete, and staff would support this, delete the first paragraph under background and the third paragraph under report. I don't think that information would detract, the removal of that information from this report would detract from its ability to be debated. Just noting that councilors probably shouldn't refer to those two paragraphs. Again, the first paragraph under background and the third paragraph under report. If they were deleted and we could move them into an confidential information memo for council and circulate that to the file if that was required, then the report could certainly be dealt with very cleanly in open session.
Okay. So that being said, Councillor Councillor Chambers.
Yeah, the reason I bring this up is that I do have several questions that are not of an in-camera nature, and I just don't want to be recognized as discussing non-in-camera items in camera. So if a motion to expunge the items that the CAO mentioned prior to going in prior to the consideration, I would like to move that the report be monitored or edited, and I don't know what the process would be, whether we have to go in camera to do that and then go out of camera, or do it before we go in camera. I would suggest I'll leave that up to the chairman.
Okay. First of all, do we have a seconder for the motion? And that the two that Mr. Bradley were talking about was the first paragraph in background and the third paragraph under the report section. Councillor Coleman, you're willing to second that? Any discussion on this? Okay, I think at this point in time, I would agree with that. So just a reminder to council that we will not pose any questions for those paragraphs in question. Does anybody have any concerns or questions about those two paragraphs? Okay, that being said, we do have a recommendation that is seconded that this will go into open session minus those paragraphs. No further questions? All those in favor? Opposed? Okay, so that motion is carried. So we will move into discussing that now. Again, there are no questions for the first paragraph in background and third paragraph under reports. Councillor Chambers, you had a few questions regarding the report. If you'd like to lead us off.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, just with regard to the question, if you'll just permit me a little bit of a preamble before I ask the questions, and that is, my question is going to be for the operation or the general manager to elaborate on the recommendation. But I can say that farm drainage is a very important issue in the rural area. The former, I'll say the western part of the county, there's over 180 some odd municipal drains, and a lot of land, agricultural land, depends on good drainage. We have had a variety of drainage superintendent type positions, from individuals to contracted companies. We have had experience with the contracting of the position, which is the recommendation, and we have had in-house, and we have had prior to amalgamation various drainage superintendents. It's been my understanding the last few years, or several years, the drainage maintenance has been done on a complaint basis rather than a organized maintenance schedule basis. By that I mean, for example, we maintain our road infrastructure. We have regular patrols and regular maintenance, and staff look after the roads. Similar with sidewalks, we have a sidewalk infrastructure program where sidewalks are maintained every year, and our staff looks at them and fixes them. But in terms of farm drainage, the municipal drains, which are an infrastructure worth millions of dollars in our county, we don't have a regular maintenance program. We don't have regular maintenance where we have staff people regularly investigating and making recommendations on drain maintenance. And we have had that in the past, but we haven't had that recently. So my question is, if we go to a drainage consultant, will there be the opportunity for this method of looking after our drain maintenance for the consultants to bring recommendations on drain maintenance independent of individual property owners bringing complaints and requests for drain maintenance?
Mr. Walton.
Through the chair to Councillor Chambers. I'll just give a bit of background of my own here. So I actually am a qualified drainage superintendent myself from many years ago. And when I was in consulting, I probably wrote more than 100 reports under the Drainage Act as well, been to the Drainage Tribunal, the like. So I actually have some good background in this. I agree that we have done this on a reactive basis in recent times. And I think that we should change that to proactive. And I think that this probably this change may allow us to do that. We were putting, a lot of other jobs on the staff people that did this in the recent past, and then what does it become? It becomes you react to the problems you have. You don't have the time to be proactive in looking for where there are problems. So I agree with that entirely, and I think both the municipal drainage and even our storm sewer systems, I think there are some things with those we need to do some more proactive. That has nothing to do with this report, but I think we need to be more proactive with our storm drainage systems in our urban areas. And accordingly, we're looking at in Burford the improvement of drainage along with this other servicing we're going to be looking at in the short period of time. So yes, I agree entirely with what you've said there, and it's been part of the business plan and looking at this is to try and bring that to fruition.
If I could just follow up, Mr. Chairman, what we need to have, in my opinion, is a regular annual report on what drains have been maintained, what requests have been made. For other members of council, I have experience with people telling me that they've been asking for drain maintenance on their municipal drains that go through their farms for not 3 and 4 months, but 3 and 4 years. In some cases, up to 7 years, people have been waiting to have their drains cleaned. They put up with this on a regular basis. In dry years, open ditches become clogged with weeds and grass and willows and everything else. And then in wet years, the drains don't work. And it's hard to react to drainage problems. They become 5 times more expensive, if not more than that, if they were regularly maintained. You can imagine it's the same scenario as a road. If you don't maintain it, if the potholes get so bad, and if you don't maintain it, then you have to do the whole road again, and it costs very much more. That can happen with municipal drains, and it does happen. Some of our municipal drains in the former township of Burford in the western half, they were built in the 1930s, in the 1920s, and some of them are getting in terrible shape. And a lot of them you can't see because they are tile drains that go through the ground, and when you get a blowout, you can fill a drain, and may not even, the people may not be aware of that. So we do need to be proactive. I would like to see, and I agree that we need to have a drainage superintendent system, and by looking at the report, which is suggesting a course of action, I would agree with that course of action if we can build into that a proactive drainage program where we can maintain our infrastructure in farm drainage the way we should be doing it, rather than the way we have been doing it in the last dozen or so years. So I can support the recommendation, and I'll be prepared to move the recommendation at the appropriate time, Mr. Chairman. But we do need to be reactive or proactive rather than reactive. Yep. And I just have one final question, and that is to the general manager. Many of the drains in my area, they begin in Oxford County, and some of them end up in Norfolk County. And a lot of them go into Big Creek, which flows through Oxford and Norfolk. My question is, I know that I think in Oxford County, they leave the drainage to the local municipalities. And I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity for municipal sharing to go on with drainage superintendent issues with townships such as Norwich, or counties such as Norfolk, or counties such as Oxford. And I wonder if that has been explored, and whether that's an alternative that can be looked at in terms of using other municipalities as our drainage consultants and superintendents.
Mr. Walton?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Chambers. That particular suggestion has not been looked into in any detail. I do know that some of the area municipalities in our neighbors to the west, I'm not sure who the drainage superintendent actually is right now in Norwich. I know some of the municipalities in Oxford County have had change in the drainage superintendents in the last few years because of retirements. And I'm not sure that some of them haven't had problems in filling some of those positions as well. So certainly something we could consider, and as we go forward.
We, in the former municipality of Burford, before amalgamation, we did have a drainage superintendent, and David's father will remember this because he was a drainage chairman back in the day. And our drainage superintendent also was our bylaw enforcement officer, as well as being our building inspector, and as well as being our animal control officer. So he did many things.
Councillor Chambers, I'm going to cut you off there. Appreciate the little history lesson there, as always. So from what I'm hearing from Mr. Walton is the fact that he agrees we could be more proactive on this, and the conversation with the other surrounding municipalities has not been had. So it is definitely something that he said is, could look into going forward. Any other questions, Councillor Miller?
No, I'm gonna emphasize what Councillor Chambers said, because I too have dealt with farmers who I'm blown away at how long it takes, and I'm sure our CAO can appreciate how many times I've contacted him about those issues. So if we could look at something along the lines of a regular maintenance, I think that would, boy, would that ever make life a lot easier for a lot of people, including our CAO. So I just wanted to share that. So thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. That being said, Mr. Chambers, you wanted to move the motion, make a motion? Do we have a seconder? Mayor Bailey? Any questions? Everybody understands what we're doing here? Okay. I'm seeing none. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you for that. That's all I have on the agenda. Our next meeting will be February the 16th. If nobody else has anything, I wish everybody a good evening, and thank you.
Well done, Chair.
Move to adjourn.
Adjourn, moved.
Mr. LaFerriere, thank you. Good night, all.
Is David still here? Guess not.